you guys and actually my family as well. So let's just start, get to the point about this end, about everything going on in Afghanistan and beyond that. So 1, 2, 3, have to unpack. So thank you so much for joining me, sir. Tell me about your initial reaction after Taliban announced the new cabinet with some of these people and the list of FBI with the bounties. What's your reaction to the new cabinet announced by the Taliban?
Well, it really seems to be the old guard. It's a lot of the old advisors for Mullah Omar, those who have been with the Taliban for a number of years. Interestingly, it includes as the Minister of Interior, the leader of the Haqqani network, which is of course designated by the United States as a terrorist entity. And it certainly doesn't include any women, nor is there a Minister of Women's Affairs, nor are there any representatives of ethnic and sectarian groupings other than perhaps some Tajiks, but certainly no Hazara, no Uzbeks. And again, it's very much, again, what the Taliban has used to lead itself in partnership with the Haqqani network and some of the others over a number of years. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising, but it is in contrast to what the Taliban have sought to say would be their approach, which would be one, you would have thought it might be a government of reconciliation, if you will, to use a term that has often characterized Afghan governments in the past. And it's certainly not that.
So, General, also you're following that one of the people they appointed as Interior Minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani. What's your reaction about that?
Well, as I noted, again, he's the leader of a group that is designated as a terrorist entity by the United States. And that is more than a bit curious and doesn't exactly fill Americans who appreciate the significance of such a designation. Doesn't impress us much, to put it mildly. It really seems as a bit of a just sort of a statement to the world that we're going to put whoever it is that we want in there. It doesn't matter how the individual is regarded by the international community and the United States, even though, of course, they desperately want US and other money and financial assistance and humanitarian support and everything else. So it's a bit tone deaf, I think, would be the way to describe it.
Yeah, many neighboring countries, they're cautiously approaching a recognition of Taliban government. What's your expectation from these neighbor countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, especially Pakistan, which is always a support to the Taliban? What do you expect from them about recognition of Taliban government?
Well, each will have its own interests and objectives relative to the Taliban. Russia will be a bit wary. It doesn't want to see illegal narcotics exports increase through the Central Asian states. It doesn't want to see a civil war. It doesn't want to see Islamist extremism emanate through the Central Asian states. Nonetheless, there's a certain degree of satisfaction that the United States, if you will, gave up in Afghanistan, as did the Soviet Union. And you would expect that they will be edging toward some kind of recognition or relationship. The Chinese, of course, are very interested in the rare earth minerals. They have long been. We encourage that, frankly. When I was the commander in Afghanistan, they've invested billions in a copper mine that is just south of Kabul, but which they were never really able to exploit because of insecurity. Now, of course, the people who were responsible for that insecurity, for the attacks on that copper mine, are in charge. So perhaps there is an opportunity for them to take advantage of, again, the extraordinary mineral wealth that Afghanistan has, noting that obviously they don't have the extractive industries, the physical plant and capital, the infrastructure, the human capital. I mean, there are many, many challenges to actually getting these minerals out of the ground and out of the country. But it may be possible now. We'll have to see, will there be some insurgency? Will there be dissatisfaction with the Taliban over time? will that manifest itself in insecurity and so forth? And again, it's just too early to tell, I think, although again, that government is certainly not one that indicates the kind of outreach and reconciliation and spirit of again, of inclusion, I think would be the best way to describe it, that the Taliban spokesperson has tried to project. Pakistan obviously has allowed the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, and a number of other groups to have their headquarters and major bases on their soil over the years for a variety of different reasons, both having to do with their capability to eliminate them, which was always in question, and also, frankly, certainly their willingness to do that. They will be happy to have the depth, the strategic depth that this gives them, as they have always termed it, noting that their principal adversary, in their mind at least, is India, although I've always shared with the Pakistanis that, India doesn't want one more inch of Pakistani soil, and why they're expending so much of their national budget to deter the Indians is a bit beyond me. But so they will probably be very quick. Of course, we saw the Director General of the Inter Services Intelligence over there already, their equivalent of the CIA director in Kabul within a couple of days of the Taliban taking over. There are allegations of Pakistani forces helping the Taliban in the Panjshir Valley, the last bastion of opposition. It's a bit murky as to what's really going on in the Panjshir. The Taliban declare that they state that they have taken control of all of it. The opposition says there are 27 valleys in the Panjshir, and the Taliban control none of them except for the main road in the main valley. So again, we'll get a little bit more clarity on that in the days and weeks that lie ahead. And that is quite significant because, again, if there is some kind of evolution to civil war or insurgency, obviously that'll present considerable challenges for the Taliban. And keep in mind that the Taliban are desperate for money. All of their assets, Afghan assets, are frozen around the world. Their access to IMF drawing rights, to World Bank support and so forth are all on hold. And they're about to find that it is much easier to be an insurgent group than it is to be in charge of the government. It's questionable whether they even have the technocratic capability actually to govern Afghanistan. But at the very least, they don't have the resources that Afghanistan is used to receiving, keeping in mind that at least 3/4 of the budget, maybe more, has been funded in recent years, really over the last 2 decades, by the United States, Japan, and a handful of other major donor nations. That all, again, is not accessible right now, and the reserves, as I mentioned, are frozen. So the Afghan people could go through a very desperate period. This could be a true humanitarian catastrophe, and the Taliban will be in charge. And the anger of the Afghan people will be aimed at them. We have seen demonstrations already, but mostly by women who are concerned about restrictions on the rights that they enjoyed over the past 20 years, which are unlikely to be realized under the Taliban. But again, days, weeks, months ahead, we'll see how this all will transpire. And then Iran has always had an interest, particularly in the southwest part of the country, also for their Shia Afghans. They have always sought to have influence. One would expect that that will continue. They do sell a fair amount of hydrocarbons to Afghanistan. And keep in mind that Afghanistan imports much of its electricity from the Central Asian states, and then it imports refined fuel products from Iran and other countries as well to generate additional electricity. The lights could go out in Kabul if those states no longer extend credit to the Taliban. So many, many challenges lie ahead, and it's going to be fascinating, frankly, to watch how they are able to deal with all the issues that are going to arise. and whether that will affect how they treat the Afghan people. I think that's the really big issue.
So Afghan government collapsed with the presence of US forces on August 16, and then with this massive evacuation and troops left on August 26. What lessons learned from this when US was leaving and ending a longest war in Afghanistan?
Well, there's a number of lessons. One could say that the biggest lesson is that the United States needs strategic patience when it comes to this kind of endeavor. That you can't take a country from the 7th century, which is how you would characterize its rule under the Taliban in the late 1990s, to the 21st century in 20 years. We should remember that the United States itself, 70 years after it declared independence, experienced a brutal civil war, had another century or so of discrimination, separate but equal. It had corruption in places like New York and Chicago. And yet we were very impatient that, Afghanistan wasn't perfect within 20 years. So certainly I think there's an issue there, especially given that we had very, very few casualties in the past few years, not just in the time since the Taliban agreement. Largely because we weren't on the front lines anymore. I think you could learn a lesson that the way to conduct these kinds of operations, now that we have the armada of drones that we can deploy, is that we can advise and assist, train and equip and enable with drones, with close air support, with intelligence fusion, rather than having to fight on the front lines. And that's a very big change because it keeps the cost to us down very considerably. And if you can keep the cost in blood and treasure down, then I think you can have a sustained commitment. Obviously, that was not the conclusion in Washington, but again, it would have been the conclusion that I would have preferred, and it is one that I have offered publicly for a number of years as well. And to its credit, the current administration is doing just that in Iraq, in Syria. It's gone back into Somalia, thousands of troops in Africa that are keeping an eye on Islamist extremists. Because again, one of the big lessons that we will learn once again, I think the hard way, is that you have to keep not just an eye on Islamist extremists, you have to keep pressure on them. Because if you don't, they can reconstitute, as the Islamic State did in Iraq after our combat forces were withdrawn, and the prime minister pursued highly sectarian actions that took the eye of the security forces off of the Islamic State and onto Sunni Arabs in the country who were demonstrating. The Islamic State ultimately was able to establish the first ever caliphate, and it took a huge effort by the Iraqi security forces, supported by the US, again, with drones, close air support, and intelligence fusion, not much frontline fighting. And the same with the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeastern Syria.
So
a number of other lessons. Obviously, there was a lack, I guess, of, I don't know if you'd call it imagination, but what could be the worst case? And in this case, the worst case came about. And again, some months ago, a number of us did publicly ask whether there could not be some kind of psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces once they realized that it's not just that Americans are gone, it's that the whole apparatus for bringing close air support to bear in individual battles is gone. The coalition had to leave because the US left. And perhaps most importantly, the 18,000 or so contractors left who used to keep the Afghan Air Force flying because we insisted on providing very sophisticated US helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. And once Afghan soldiers realized that there's no one coming to the rescue, as the Taliban launched a simultaneous offensive in a number of locations all around the country, really quite skillfully, I might add, having positioned forces and already having been texting with the local leaders and all the rest of that. And again, once these local leaders and the local Afghan security forces realize nobody's coming to help us with reinforcement, there's no emergency resupply of ammunition and food and water, there's no emergency medical evacuation, and above all, there's no close air support, were in big trouble. And they did what Afghans have always done over many, many centuries, which is identify a change in the wind that is very significant and then adapt to it. And they cut deals with the Taliban, and that then became an epidemic, if you will, of surrender, of collapse, or what have you, which ultimately culminated with the president leaving Afghanistan without even telling some of his closest advisors. That appeared to catch Washington by surprise. It appears that they thought that there would be much more time to evacuate not just US citizens and green card holders, but also all these other categories that they had announced. The longstanding special immigrant visa applicants. These are the battlefield interpreters who spent 2 years or more on the ground with our men and women in uniform, for whom there was a very bureaucratic policy over the years, really a result of 3 successive administrations, especially the previous US administration, not allowing that to move quickly. And so that was a big surprise. They weren't ready for that. And then they'd expanded the category to really anybody whose security was in jeopardy because of their work with the United States. Well, that's way over tens of thousands. That's probably hundreds of thousands when you take the individuals times the 2 or 3 family members each that they would bring with them. And there was just no sufficient preparation for that. And the situation became really quite chaotic, as we saw around the entry control points in particular. And then that became an attractive target for the Islamic State suicide bomber, and on and on. And then we determined that we weren't going to stay beyond 31 August and pulled out. So clearly there are still some Americans, a small number, that we will have to get out, and I'm sure that we'll take care of that. There are undoubtedly some green card holders as well. But what we're going to do about the special immigrant visa applicants and then the additional category is not crystal clear at this time, how they're going to be able to apply for that if we don't have an embassy in Kabul or anywhere in the country. Again, it will all have to be done via the internet virtually, and that could be pretty challenging. And then what's the mechanism for them to go to the airport, get a flight out, and so forth. Again, a lot of that is still very, very fluid and very loose.
Thank you very much for explaining about the evacuation. It was my next question. Perfect. Many people believe about the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups using Afghanistan as sanctuaries, or they may return or start or plot any attacks against the West or the US. What US has to do, and also I think Lindsey Graham was saying that we maybe send troops back to Afghanistan. What's your thoughts about it, and how it should be avoided not to use Afghanistan as a base for these such terrorist attacks?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, what we have to do is keep a very close eye on, in this case, Al-Qaeda, and also the Islamic State Khorasan group, the affiliate of the Islamic State in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And should they seem to be developing a sanctuary from which they can project attacks in the way that Al-Qaeda did from Afghanistan soil when the 9/11 attacks were planned there under Taliban rule, we have to make sure that we disrupt it, we degrade it, and ideally we destroy it. Now, this will be challenging given that our nearest bases now are in the Gulf states. We have no bases from which we can fly drones or other aircraft in the Central Asian states, nor indeed in the South Asian states. So that's going to take a fair amount of logistics. It'll consume a lot of the time of a drone to fly to and from Afghanistan. I mean, it could be 50 or 60% of the dwell time, depending on how the drones are configured, just to get to and from Afghanistan. And of course, if you don't have all the other elements of intelligence, human intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, again, intelligence from the internet, from social media, cell phone networks, et cetera, if some of those elements are missing, it just makes it more difficult. I don't expect to see a near-term threat from Afghanistan outside of Afghanistan. I don't even expect it into the major NATO partners and allies of the United States, as we saw with the Islamic State when it had the caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. That was a very serious terrorist problem. And I certainly don't expect to see threats to our homeland, although it's possible if they are able to establish a very effective virtual caliphate, as the Islamic State had at the height of their power on the ground in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria, and they were able to motivate, to inspire, to guide, to encourage, direct, and so forth, extremists in Western Europe in particular. But nonetheless, we have to make very sure that this kind of capability cannot be developed. And I'm sure that the marching orders to the military and to the intelligence community are very clear on this, especially given the significance of this entire decision for the Biden administration.
So last question, sir. 9/11 is and the age is coming up, the anniversary. Many veterans are furious the way the war ended in Afghanistan. What is your message on 9/11, the anniversary, 20 years and ending the longest war in Afghanistan? Was the mission accomplished?
Well, first of all, I don't know that we have ended the long war. I mean, we've ended our involvement in the long war. We'll see whether the so-called endless war really is over, or if there does develop an insurgency, perhaps civil war. I'm not sure that the Central Asian states will be as accommodating to would-be insurgents as Pakistan was to the Taliban and the Haqqani network and so forth, which is, of course, a huge challenge to the effort on the ground. I mean, it was the most significant difference, let's say, between Afghanistan and Iraq, although there were plenty of others as well. And it's why I told Congress, as the commander in Afghanistan, that we would not be able to accomplish there what we had accomplished during the surge in Iraq, where violence was driven down by some 85 or 90%. Certainly, there is an aspect to this that our involvement in the war, which actually will still continue as well, because we do have to keep an eye on Islamist extremists in Afghanistan. And I don't think we'll see boots on the ground, enduring boots on the ground, or some kind of deployment there, although I'd be delighted if the Taliban would say, hey, look, we're so intent on making sure that extremists cannot use our soil that you're welcome back to Bagram Air Base or something like that. That would be quite a significant statement and step forward for the Taliban. Not expected. So we'll have to keep an eye. But obviously, I think a lot of veterans who are keenly aware of the sacrifice, of the extraordinarily hard work, all that was required to achieve what Afghanistan did enjoy for 20 years, however imperfect the government and forces and everything else may have been. Certainly that was preferable to the Taliban. And the idea that the force that we fought for 20 years because it harbored al-Qaeda in Afghanistan when the 9/11 attacks were planned there, the idea that it is in charge now obviously is a, it's a very, very sort of bitter outcome, again, for those who were very heavily invested in what we did in Afghanistan and who had hopes for the future and who were involved in other ways. For example, my wife and I fund a scholarship for a woman who goes to the American University of Afghanistan. Well, she's not there anymore. She's studying in Doha, Qatar. And again, obviously, they really wanted to stay in their own country. They weren't eager to leave. This is one reason why a lot of Afghans didn't leave until it was too late, because they really preferred to stay with family, to stay with the businesses they'd built, to help Afghanistan achieve its potential, and to make the most of the opportunities under a government that, again, however flawed it may have been, certainly was preferable to the Taliban government. So it is a different 9/11 for a lot of us who I think served there and were deployed a lot during the past 20 years of war, especially during the height of the war years, when obviously I was privileged to command the surge in Iraq and then the largest contingent that we had in Afghanistan. And it's a very somber celebration, if you will. There have been many achievements during that time, certainly bringing Osama bin Laden to justice, shattering the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the early days, numerous individual successes against very senior extremist leaders from, including Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, Anwar al-Awlaki, a host of these over the years, but also a recognition that you have to continue it, that you cannot take your eye off an extremist threat because it can reconstitute. And of course, there is a concern about that now because of the challenge of distance and cost and everything else to do all of this from offshore. So yes, it is, I think, a bit different how many of us will reflect on 20 years of war, given the outcome in Afghanistan. But that is a reality. And the key now is to focus forward to meet the moral obligation that we have to the special immigrant visa applicants, to the many others whose lives and security of their family members put in jeopardy by the service that they rendered for the United States, for our embassy partners, and so on. So that's, I think, how many of us, at least, will approach this particular 9/11, which, of course, is the 20th anniversary of the attacks that took us down these roads to Afghanistan and Iraq and a host of other places around the world.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, sir. Also, Taliban are inaugurating on September 11. I don't know if you saw that or not, Denise.
They are what?
They're inaugurating on September 11, inauguration. They are swearing in the new cabinet on September 11. That they're saying that September 11 now we are doing it.
Well, that'll be a bittersweet moment.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that.